Now, tonight's program on Addiction 101 will be presented by Jim Ballmer. Jim was a co-founder of Dawn Farm in 1973 and has worked for the farm since 1983, first as clinical director and later in his current role as president. Jim has led Dawn Farm through its growth from a single residential program to the continuum of programs that Dawn Farm provides today. He has trained addiction professionals around the United States and in the Philippines, Japan, and Kazakhstan. He has co-authored articles and papers on addiction and recovery and is in the process of writing a book that will describe Dawn Farm's unique history, mission, and values. So please join me in giving a warm Ed Series welcome to Jim.
How y'all doing? You came to brave the snow. I love that. We could be snowed in here, so we might be here a while. I highly recommend the upcoming programs. Carl Christensen has been involved in the addiction treatment field for a long time. Amazing guy. And also in April, is it April that we're having the NA text?
Yes.
This is a great program that I've seen before. A guy named Chris Budnick will be coming from North Carolina to talk about the writing of the basic text of Narcotics Anonymous. It is an absolutely fascinating story. So come back. And this is Addiction 101. It's very important you know this is not Addiction 102. For greater science, Carl Christensen is a great example. Do we have another one by Mark Weiner coming up?
I believe so.
Yeah. Follow us. There are esteemed, smart, way smarter people than me who are doing this. Is 101, okay? And what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of insight and a few more skills that'll help you look at this problem, all right? Now, actually, let me just say, there are going to be times when I'm going to ask a question. And even though they said hold your questions till the end, I'm not going to hold my questions to the end. So I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm actually going to expect someone to say something. So if you don't, and if you don't say it loud, I may not know that you're saying it. But if you don't respond, I'll just kind of stand here, all right, until someone says something. Or I'll lean in on these guys who have seen this before. How many of you know who Abraham Maslow was? All right, a few of you. The great Abe Maslow, great psychotherapist. You've heard the term self-actualization. You've heard of the hierarchy of needs. And Abe Maslow, we could talk about Abe Maslow a lot, but he said if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. And what does that have to do with addiction? Remember I told you there were going to be these moments? This is the first one. What does that have to do with addiction? How you understand a problem makes a difference in terms of how you treat it, right? No, it's part of the American lexicon. Addiction is a disease. We all know it, right? We're comfortable with it. So who's the largest provider of services for people with drug and alcohol problems in the United States? So we all know it's part of, that's exactly right. Jails and prisons, right? We call it a disease, but do we functionally treat it as a disease in this country? Right? No. And it matters. It matters. Because in fact, and I'll tell you a little bit later, the field that I've been in almost 47 years has been decimated in recent years. When we talk about the opiate crisis and we talk about everything that's going on in the world related to substance use, it has to be put in context. And so hopefully I'll give you a little bit of insight about that. Now, for those who don't know, this is the early version of Google. There are people on my staff who I had to inform what this was. Back in there was a time when everybody had one of these, right? How many of you have? I don't have one anymore. But if we're going to go back in time, let's say 35 or so years, and that's on your kitchen table, and you got a loved one who's got a drug and alcohol problem, and you go back to addiction or drug and alcohol, and you can flip through page after page after page of treatment centers. And you really care about is that you look at the first line of the first paragraph. Now, alcoholism is not a clinical term, it's a social term, but we use it interchangeably. Alcoholism is simply alcohol dependence or alcohol addiction. But alcoholism is a primary chronic disease. Well, what does primary mean? It's not only does it need to be treated first, but it's also not the result of something else. Well, that's important when you hear people say, well, it's a result of bad environment. It's a result of underlying psychopathology. It's a result of poor parenting, for goodness sake. It's not the result of something else, right? Alcoholics and addicts are not self-medicating some other kind of underlying pathology. It's primary. Chronic. Chronic. What's chronic mean? Right, it doesn't go away, right? And of course, how many of you know somebody who's a diabetic who doesn't take perfect good care of themselves? A lot of you. And the reality is that if you're a diabetic and you take not so great care of yourself and you become symptomatic, and you've got, some kind of an infection that won't heal, or your eyes are going bad, you have heart disease or anything, and you show up at one of the local hospitals, they will admit you and treat you for what's wrong because you have chronic disease. If you show up with addiction, even if you have secondary symptoms to addiction, you will be told that there aren't any addiction treatment beds. In this hospital, right here, there are no addiction treatment beds. At your university hospital, there are no addiction treatment beds. So primary chronic disease, right? Maslow said you got to have more than a hammer, right? That helps you with your toolbox, okay? Primary chronic, all right? Now, there are problems. I had a roommate in college who was red-green colorblind. And if my friend was here and his wife hadn't helped dress him, you might be able to tell that he was colorblind. But if he was here and I pointed out this apple to him and asked him what color it was, he would say, it's red. Now, I lived with him, and I can assure you he does not see the color red. He sees more of a tan. But he calls red stuff red. So he and I can have a conversation about red stuff. He knows Santa Claus has a red suit. But we don't see the same thing, right? And addiction is the same way. If you ask an alcoholic, do you like the effect of alcohol? They will very likely say, yes, I do. Now, my late mother, God rest her soul, was the antithesis of an alcoholic. She would order half a glass of white Zinfandel wine with an ice cube in it, and she would sip on it for an hour, and she would eventually push it away, half drunk, saying, thanks, I've had enough. I'm beginning to feel it. Never lived to be 90. I never saw her intoxicated. I don't know if she ever was intoxicated, or if she was, I don't know what it looked like. But the point is if she was still alive and you asked her, do you like the effect of alcohol? She would say, yes, I do. At which point we look at the alcoholic and we say, well, they're just a hedonist, right? And alcoholics come and sit in my office all the time and they say, oh, I just like to get high more than other people. I like to drink more than other people. And they believe that. And it isn't true. Okay? Adding one more thing to your toolbox. It is not true. Addicts and alcoholics may think that. They metabolize alcohol differently than normal human beings. An alcoholic metabolizes alcohol one way, maybe not just their brain, but also their liver, but certainly different than my mother, and different than most of the population. And contextually, in the United States, about 35% of the population doesn't drink beverage alcohol at all. Did you know that? Right? Now, when I tell clients at the farm that, they're astonished. But then they don't hang around with people who don't drink alcohol. Of the remaining roughly 2/3 of the population who drink, historically, generally, we felt 1 out of every 8 to 10 people who drink beverage alcohol develop alcoholism. So you're not talking about huge numbers, right? And you're really talking about single-digit percentile of the population who, when they're exposed to alcohol, their wiring is different, they metabolize it differently, they're different, okay? Now, the other story that I talked to my daughter Grace on the way over here, she has finally gotten over the fact that I tell this story. She is 36 years old now, and when she was a little girl, she did not like to eat peas. Now we would serve peas with a meal, and Gracie is a good kid, and she would always take a bite, and she would always make a terrible face. Oh. She would make this terrible face. She would say, I don't like the way it feels in my mouth. When she was 8, she made I'm looking for the book she made. She made a little pamphlet when she was 8 years old called I Hate Peas, where she drew a little picture of a pile of peas with the circle and the slash. It's very cute, and I hope I can get it in here before I retire. But the point is that she hated peas. Now, one day, her mother made split pea soup from scratch with a big ham bone in it and cooked it on the stove for hours and hours and served it. And Gracie was always willing to try. Gracie took a bite. Now, if we were to go back in time, that was 28 years ago, and ask Grace, do you like peas? She'd say, absolutely not, hate them. Her mother and I would say, Gracie does not prefer peas. She took a bite of that soup and she loved it. She loved it. And not only did she love it, it was the first time she'd ever eaten a pea where it wasn't terrible. So she was like thrilled, and she scarfed that bowl of soup down. And her eyes began to swell shut. And she got hives on her face and down her neck and chest, and she began to have difficulty breathing. And we had to take her to urgent care because Gracie's allergic to legumes. Not just peas, but peas and lentils and chickpeas, a couple of beans. To this day, still allergic to peas. Now the point of that story, maybe two things. One is that up until that point in time where we titrated her dose of peas into a soup, everybody thought she was making a choice, including her, right? We thought she was choosing. She thought she was choosing. Now we think she had a little mechanism in her mouth that when it got exposed to a pea, said something to her brain saying, stop right now or you're going to be like really sorry. And she was too young to articulate what it meant. But so we all were wrong. We thought she was making a choice. We were all wrong. The other thing is, when did she become allergic to peas? It's an important concept to think about. At what point, because I talk to families all the time and they say, well, my kid's been using drugs and alcohol since they were 16, but they were goofy when they were 11, right? Something was wrong with them when they were 11. And it begs the question, it's helpful to not think about addiction just based on evidence of drug use, okay? Because it's much more than that, and I'll try and share a little bit about that. Does this make sense to folks? All right. It's important you know, with all the Sturm and Drang, all the stuff you see in the newspaper, when I say this is a disease, you can't catch it, your brain is responding differently, I'm talking about opioids as well. Very difficult to be 25 in this society and not have taken an opioid drug. And if you are, I'm guessing probably everybody in this room has been exposed to an opioid drug. If you are like most people, better than 90% of the population, the room spun around and you felt queasy and icky and sick to your stomach. You may have gotten pain relief, but you didn't feel wonderful. You felt poopy. When I tell heroin addicts that at the farm, their jaws drop. Because their experience of taking opioids is fundamentally different, right? Not only do they not feel muddy, they'll use exalted language, almost religious language. They feel relief. And instead of wanting to sleep it off, they want to rearrange their closet at 2 o'clock in the morning. They have what we call a paradoxical reaction. They're not wired like normal people, right? And alcoholics are similar. Typically, you'll have, if you ask an alcoholic, the first time they really got exposed sufficiently to alcohol, they can very often recite to you what clothes they were wearing, what was playing on the radio. It's a seminal moment for them, and we sometimes call it a signature experience, where they have this sense of relief, right? And it's because up until then, one of the great myths about addiction is that addiction is about pleasure, when in fact, addiction is about the absence of pleasure. Addicts and alcoholics are what we call anhedonic. They have trouble accessing normal human pleasure, and they take a drink or a drug that they're hardwired for. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, used to say that he lived in a state of being restless, irritable, and discontent. And he would drink a drink of alcohol, not a big drink, but just a regular drink of alcohol, and it would click.
There it is.
And he would experience what he called ease and comfort. It changed him. And if only he could stay there, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about tolerance and loss of control, but it turned off the noise in his head, right? It made him feel comfortable. You'll hear alcoholics and addicts talk about being social, being wallflowers, being unable to negotiate the social scene, feeling lonely and isolated, and they take a drink or they take their drug, and it's like the world opens up, and they often will say, well, this must be what it's like to be like normal, okay? All right, but so make no mistake, you can't catch this, right? We could talk about pharma. Pharma didn't help, but they didn't make people into addicts, all right? Now, you don't want to get, you all know, you study brain in school, all right? Prefrontal cortex, used to call it, in my day, the forebrain. This is where your judgment, your executive function is. You don't want to get hit really hard on this part of your head. It'll ruin a lot. But this is your top-down control, right? This is where values and judgment and cognition, right? Important stuff up here. That's not where addiction happens. Addiction happens right in the center there. If you put your finger here and right here, right in the center is what we call the mesolimbic pathway, the limbic system. We used to call it the midbrain. It is the primitive brain. It is the instinctive brain. Most people don't access a lot. If you're sitting in a chair and you lean far back and you almost fall over, you get a burst of norepinephrine, your fight or flight syndrome hits, and you act very quickly. It includes appetites for food and sex and sleep. And the times that normal people experience this part of their brain, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, God forbid it's now, but you had a good night's sleep last night, and you're at work or you're in a classroom, or God forbid you're driving a car, and this brain decides it's time for you to take a little nap. And it goes, sleep, sleep, right? And your prefrontal cortex kicks in and goes, no, 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 no. And your midbrain goes, sleep, right? And I assume you've been in that situation where you had this sort of organic desire to sleep that felt like it was greater than and you're splashing water on your face, or if you're driving a car, you're rolling down the window. That's this brain, this primitive brain, okay? We sometimes affectionately refer to it as the reptile or the lizard brain. You also encounter this brain when you're on a diet and you're at a buffet line or a potluck supper. And that's when that particular brain takes on a voice and actually talks to you and says things like, you've been doing great. And half a cookie, you know, when a cookie breaks, most of the calories actually escape into the air. Half a cookie has fewer calories, and cheesy potatoes is kind of a vegetable, sort of. And you look around and you see how many people struggle with their weight, and you think, okay, powerful brain, right? And support this is a powerful brain that gets hijacked, right? And once it's hijacked by addiction, once the biological process, you walk into it hardwired, but once that interaction between that hardwired brain and drugs starts moving, a couple things happen. One, it sets into motion a variety of symptoms. I mentioned, Gracie would get a pee in her mouth and she'd get a signal to her brain. Well, addicts have an allergic reaction in a sense, except instead of saying stop, it says more. It sets into motion all these other kinds of things. And the other thing that happens is that once this part of the brain gets hijacked, this part of the brain is no longer in charge. Okay? Very important, right? Why do they behave this way? We know this person, right? And it's because this part of the brain is in charge now. In the question of who's the real person, Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, the real person is Dr. Jekyll. And Mr. Hyde is a neurological distortion. And it is not the real person. Okay? It's really important you know that. Now, lizard brain. This is some of this, not all by any stretch, but some of the symptoms of active addiction. Mental obsession is a phrase coined by Bill Wilson from AA. Actually, I think I have my next slide. If you picture one's life like a wagon wheel, I could. The center of this wheel is what drives you. Okay, this hub is what makes you tick. What causes you to behave the way you do. And it might be love, it might be family, it might be morality, it might be ambition, any number of things, and multiple things drive us to do the things we do. Mental obsession. First thing that happens to people who suffer from addiction is that the driving force of that hub changes. And it becomes, make sure I can maintain this addiction. Okay? Now it's thought, and it's not thought out, but it nonetheless, mental obsession takes up more and more space, right? The pursuit of maintaining their addiction takes up more and more space in their life. Now, these spokes that come off of it are the various activities that get impacted by that focus. They maintain supply. Right? If you're drinking and you're going someplace where there's going to be alcohol served, you drink before you go. Or you throw a six-pack in the trunk of the car so you know you have enough. You're constantly thinking about making sure that you can have enough of your drug. You use in ways that replace other things. I would say if you're on the soccer team and soccer practice gets in the way of using, you stop playing soccer. If there are people who give you a hard time about your drinking, you discard them. You distance yourself from those people. And one of the characteristics of active addiction is your world starts to shrink. And eventually your world gets really small, right? Until it's pretty much just you with your drug in a room alone, right? Because you discard the things that prevent you from maintaining this condition. You use despite consequences. Instead of breaking out in a rash like Gracie, addicts and alcoholics break out in handcuffs and hospitals and nut wards. And a typical person, if you were to get arrested for drunk driving, a non-alcoholic will never drive drunk again. They're so mortified by the experience. And an alcoholic will mentally prepare. When they changed the law from 0.10 to 0.08, alcoholics in the state of Michigan started mentally preparing themselves to go to jail because they knew they probably wouldn't be able to pull it off. All right, so does this make sense? It starts to impinge on every activity of their life, right? And it's because they're obsessed with maintaining it. Now this is not thought through. This is, I'll go back. All right. Craving. Craving is another one of those things that is a language problem. As we think about craving a piece of chocolate cake, right? While craving for an addict or an alcoholic is like craving a breath at the bottom of a swimming pool full of water, right? For years I've been sharing it's a terrible story, but it's my favorite craving story. It's about a young man who was at the farm decades ago, and he crack cocaine addict, and he had been there a couple weeks, and he decided to leave. He came to us, he says, I got to go get high. We said, dude, don't you have like lots of legals? And he was, yeah, I can't help it, I got to go. And we got his probation officer on the phone, and his probation officer said, stop what you're doing right now. This was your last chance. I told you, you're looking at 5 years of prison time. If you leave Dawn Farm, it's a little less than a mile from Dawn Farm to the corner of Stony Creek Road and Textile in Ypsilanti Township. He said, you will not make it to the stop sign. I will call the sheriff's department, Station 2, which is not too far away, and they will come and arrest you, and I will violate you, and you will go to prison. Right? Now this kid was drug-free, right? What do you think happened? Yeah, he left. And he didn't make it to the stop sign at Textile and got arrested and went to prison. Right? Now, that's a great story, a terrible story. But it's important that you know, anybody who wants to tell you that this is some kind of an alternative lifestyle choice, now this guy was drug-free, and at that moment in time, he was completely insane. In the parlance of AA, he could not tell the truth from the false, right? And that's what craving can do to people. Tolerance. Tissue tolerance simply means it takes more of the drug to achieve the same effect. It is, by the way, one of the reasons why I'm no fan of attempting to medicate titrated dose downward, because it's a moving target. I'll give you two quick stories. There's a woman in town who was an administrator of a hospital, and she was picked up on the streets of Plymouth, not because they thought she was intoxicated, but because they thought maybe she'd had a stroke. She was behaving oddly. And they took her to the hospital, and at a certain point, they were talking to her and running tests. Somebody said, "Have we considered doing a drug test on this woman?" And they hadn't. And so 90 minutes after they picked her up, they ran a full screen drug test on her. And her blood alcohol level was 0.575, which, by the way, is hard to do. She's not the area record, but she's close. And generally speaking, 0.08, if you're driving a car, you're going to go to jail. It's legally drunk. 0.4 is generally considered to be the death threshold. That's when the anesthetic effect of alcohol starts to work on your heart and lungs. Like I said, she's not the record, but who knows what she was 90 minutes before. 0.575 with a couple hours without drinking, who knows. Now, she was a kind of tiny little woman, and she's been sober a long time. But the point is no one thought she was drunk. She was questioning the credentials of the attending physician in the ER as they found out exactly how impaired she was. The other story I'll tell is another individual who's also been sober a long time. And when he was arrested, he was charged with obtaining drugs under false pretenses with intent to deliver. Feds showed up. It was a big deal. And they charged him that way in large part because they went to the state police toxicology lab and they said, is it humanly possible for a person to take this many Percocets? And the tox guys, many of whom I've known over the years, said, no, it's physically impossible for somebody to do that. Not only is the opiate load way too great, but the Tylenol, the acetaminophen in the Percocet is such that if you were to take a number of them, you'd overdose and you'd cause liver failure. And his liver was apparently fine. So they assumed he was selling, he was diverting. Now, the change in the law actually has his name attached to it, because they had testimony that, in fact, addicts and alcoholics have sometimes they're just as their brains don't behave normally, their livers sometimes don't behave normally either. Now, the reason that they originally charged him that way was because he cashed scripts, prescriptions for himself for the last month he used for 4,600 Percocets. He was doing in excess of 150 Percocets a day and doing morning rounds every day as a practicing physician at the hospital here. Right. Now, I want you to know, if we were to divvy up 150 Percocets, there are some recovering people in the room, some people who have done opiates in this room. They'd have to call a lot of ambulances, even if we just all split them. It's a massive, massive load. The worst heroin addict you've ever seen never got anywhere near 150 Percocets. So, and his liver's fine. Go figure, right? They're mutants. They're not like other people. Loss of control. Loss of control is the one-sentence definition of addiction, and it is very simply the inability to predict what will happen to you once you begin to use. It does not mean that every time you drink or use you turn into a werewolf. It means, however, you can't be sure. You can't be sure what's going to happen, right? And the story I've been telling for more than 40 years is the guy who gets up in the morning and he's getting ready for work. And his wife says, honey, it's your daughter's 12th birthday and the in-laws are coming over. Please don't drink today. And there's history there, and he's chided. Now, the good news, bad news story about alcoholics and addicts is that they're not sociopaths for the most part. with rare exceptions. And which is good, because sociopaths are pretty hard to treat. And the bad news is they're not sociopaths. Why is that bad news? Because it means they have a conscience, and they experience grief and shame and self-loathing, and they are not oblivious to the harm they cause ever. And so this guy skulks out of the house, having been chastened by his wife, and he loves his family, and he goes to work, and sometime during the day, his midbrain starts to have a conversation with him, and his midbrain says, Joe, she said don't drink, but it's not really what she meant. What she meant was don't get drunk and screw things up. Please, don't get drunk. And he knows how hard those family parties are, how tense they are. And so he stops at the local watering hole on his way home, right? And we're all there. And we sit him down and we hook him up to a polygraph. And we say, Joe, how many drinks you going to have? And Joe says, just once, my kid's birthday, right? And he passes the lie detector test, right? Because he's telling the truth, right? Now, you know the end of the story? It's midnight, and he's drunk. Now, he's stopped at this bar before and had a drink and gone home, but not tonight, right? And he doesn't know why. He is baffled. And the worst part about it is that he's going to go home, and he's going to look into the eyes of his loved ones. And it's an exquisitely awful look that only addicts and alcoholics get to see, that look of, how could you? What's wrong with you? How could you do this? Right? And he doesn't know. And you can drink a lot or you can drink a little, but if you have loss of control, you're an addict. Right? And in fact, for what it's worth, again, for more than 40 years, I've had a standing test for whether or not, every now and then someone will say, was there some kind of way that I could find out whether I'm an alcoholic? I say, absolutely. And I share this with you. You may take it out to the world. Feel free to use it. And it's very simple. You tell the person, you pick a drink. I believe this would work with other drugs as well, but for the sake of argument, you pick a drink. And it can be a significant drink. I mean, it can be a tumbler of liquor. And then you pick a time of day. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you work first shift. So after dinner, you have a tumbler of liquor that you get to drink, right? And you drink that every day for 30 days. That's it. Foolproof test. No one has ever passed that test. Now, there are only two rules. The one rule is you can't drink more than that drink. And the other rule is you can't not drink it. And that's the point where I can tell you, I can count on my fingers the numbers of alcoholics who have said, oh, I think I'm going to try it. Most people say, I'll go to treatment, because they know that they can't do it, right? And they know they can't do it because they understand that they have loss of control, and they know for a fact that they can't predict what will happen to them once they begin to drink, right? So, all right. Blackouts. Blackouts are to be not to be confused with the fraternity party, what did I do last night, right? People who laugh about not remembering the night before know exactly what they did the night before. People who have legitimate blackouts don't find them funny. They walk casually out of their house in the morning and look at the front end of their car and are grateful that there's no damage to it and there's no human on it. I know tons of people who have come out of blackouts and knocked on the door to inquire what they were arrested for, and are grateful that it's merely drunk driving, that they haven't killed someone, right? I had a friend who's now deceased who was a sitting judge, I won't tell you where, who would come out of blackouts on the bench and would have to take a recess and read the transcript so he knew what case he was hearing. Oh. It was not funny. Physical dependency is not required. The cocaine guy, there's no discrete withdrawal syndrome from crack cocaine. You get sleepy and hungry and uncomfortable and unhappy, dopamine depleted. But if you do have a drug that produces a physical dependence, like alcohol, like opioids, the withdrawal syndrome is the opposite of the effect of the drug. All right? Questions about this? No? Okay. All right, so first piece of bad news every addict has to come to terms with is that they don't get to use anymore, right? And people often look at me like I'm crazy when I suggest that that's bad news. It is bad news. It's bad news because it's the only thing that's ever reliably made the alcoholic or addict feel comfortable in their skin. Now, they will never say this to you. They will never say this to probation officer or mom or dad. You don't get it. Drugs and alcohol fixes what's wrong with my head. They won't say that because it just pisses us off, right? But that's the truth. Fraught with consequences, imperfect, an imperfect solution. But addicts and alcoholics, for addicts and alcoholics, drugs and alcohol quiets the noise in their head. It makes them feel more normal, right? And so most people who come in to a place like the farm to get help, they assume they're walking in to begin a long psychic diet where they're always like having an itch you can't scratch, right? They know they're always going to know how to fix it, and they won't be able to, but maybe they won't go to the nut ward or jail anymore, right? Maybe they won't traumatize their family again and again and again. They'll never be comfortable in their skin. Now, so that's why it's bad news. It's not the only piece of bad news. Here's the second piece of bad news. This is what they're like when they're not using. There's a whole series of symptoms that addicts and alcoholics suffer from when they're not using, which is why they use. Okay? Now, eventually I will change this slide. Excuse me. Because I think I've learned that a better word than fear is dread. Alcoholics and addicts live in a constant state of dread. They view their lives as a series of obstacles, like riding a wave of anxiety and relief. And it's all in front of them, and it's never enough. If I can make it to bedtime, if I can make it through the day, if I can make it to the paycheck, if I can make it to the relationship or the job or the degree or everything's in front of them. And it's all caught up with this anxiety. Now, if we were to, there are a handful of people here in the room who are recovering. If you ask an active addict or alcoholic how they feel, they got to think about it. Because they develop a compulsive defense that calluses them from how they really feel. They literally don't know how they feel anymore. That's a defense that keeps them from driving their car into a bridge abutment, by the way. The fact that they're no longer very in touch with their feelings is not an entirely bad thing. Because remember, they're not sociopaths, so they feel it all, right? But if you were to ask someone to think about it for a while, and I do this all the time in my office, they don't remember the last time they weren't afraid. They've been waking up scared and going to bed scared since they were a little kid. They were the kid in the 3rd grade class who knew the answer to the question on the chalkboard, and they didn't raise their hand because they didn't want everybody looking at them, right? And they invariably can't remember a time when that wasn't their whole sense of themselves, right? The idea of being a man among men, a woman among women, they always see themselves as the object of scrutiny. They walk into a room feeling totally uncomfortable in their skin, unless they get high, in which case they literally walk into a place where they're terribly uncomfortable, they have a drink of alcohol or they have some other drug, and they're like, you know, I can dance, right? And no, I'm not going to dance. So that would be bad enough. To be consumed with fear, to really have your baseline emotional state be fear, is bad. Except that in addition to that, addicts have this almost existential loneliness, this sense of apartness. If you ever have the opportunity to go hear people give an open talk, they will invariably riff on this sense of never feeling right-sized, always feeling uncomfortable in their skin, being in a room full of people who love them and feeling completely alone. Well, make no mistake, there are other people who are neurotic in that way, except the drink of alcohol doesn't make them better. That's how we know they don't have a discrete anxiety disorder, because people who have legitimate anxiety disorders take a drink and it does not fix what's wrong with them. They are hypersensitive. They hurt more than other people. Their feelings are easily hurt. I had an alcoholic friend who said, I don't have enough insulation. I hurt more than other people. They are insecure, they're fear-based, but they have all sorts of assets that are in one sense a benefit and in another sense a detriment. There is pretty good science that says that alcoholics and addicts have a higher IQ than the general population. They are often really smart. They do not lack willpower. Add to your toolbox, addicts and alcoholics don't. I go to church groups or Rotary or something, there's always somebody who will say, well, I have too much willpower to be an addict or an alcoholic. And I will propose the test to you that I do to them. How many of you know somebody with an addiction? Hands up. Okay. How many of you ever had an argument with the person with the addiction? How many ever won the argument? Right. Right. Addicts and alcoholics, Bill Wilson said that addicts and alcoholics suffered from self-will run riot. They're pathologically egocentric. It is, by the way, one of the reasons why conventional, traditional, modern psychotherapy works so poorly with addicts and alcoholics, because empowerment is sort of the theme of traditional psychotherapy these days. I have a friend who calls it the Burger King theory of personality. Have it your way. But traditional modern psychotherapy helps people take control of their lives. And that is the quest of every untreated addict or alcoholic. And they have this conversation with people they love. If I just need a little room, I can fix this, right? I know how to do it now. And if you just give me a little space, I can work this out. And of course, they're good at everything else, right? Like I say, they're perfectionists. They usually, where they work, the run and joke in the recovering community is somebody will get sober, and a year into their sobriety, you find out that they have a master's degree in some kind of specialized astroengineering, and they worked on a NASA project. That happens all the time, right? People who are like brilliant and deranged at the same time. They develop these, remember this is the defend part of the brain, this is fight or flight, and so they develop these compulsive defenses. They rationalize, they minimize, they justify, they blame others. And it becomes this structure. And there's an old joke in the field that recovery from addiction is a greater miracle than the resurrection of the dead, because the dead don't fight back. So, does this make sense to folks? Now, I describe this to people like a noise. It's not a noise, but most addicts and alcoholics can relate to it like a noise, a sense of growing discomfort. And the longer they're away from their drug, these symptoms get worse and worse and worse and worse. All right? So, first piece of bad news, don't get to use it anymore. Got to grieve the loss of the only thing that's ever made you feel okay in your skin. And the second piece of bad news is that if you don't do the real work of recovery, if all you do is abstain, you'll hate your life. Your head will be like a bad neighborhood. And this is how most folks who come into treatment think. You know, they're going to live with those symptoms, and maybe they won't go to jail anymore, right? But it's work, right? And make no mistake, getting sober, seeking recovery is an act of nobility. It's an act of bravery. Anybody who shows up at a treatment center without knowing for sure that this is even possible, that getting over this is possible, pretty amazing stuff. All right. And so here's what happens. They drink or use as long as they can, right? You can't use forever. There are biological things that go wrong. You end up getting arrested. Stuff happens. You can't drink or use forever. And then you stay sober. That noise gets incrementally louder. And maybe at first you've got willpower. At first you look for some other kind of chaos in your life. You know, maybe it's in relationships, or maybe you're doing other kind of criminals, or any number of things. But eventually, and maybe you finally decide, well, I'm not going to drink hard liquor, or I'm not going to do heroin. I'll smoke a little pot, right? It's herbal, right? That's a joke, by the way. But then eventually, maybe the wheels won't come off quite so fast if I just sort of tease around the edge. And eventually, they're back in the same rut. And again, they have a conscience. They experience grief and shame and failure. Failure. All right? Now, bottoms. People ask me about bottoms all the time. I don't believe in going out of my way to relieve people of their natural consequences. That being said, I don't believe in bottoms. And I think for the most part, all of us at the farm don't believe in bottoms. We see people who live on the bottom. We see people who bounce on the bottom. Consequences are not enough to get addicts and alcoholics better. That's unfortunate, but because they get terrible, terrible consequences. But I've seen people in our detox 50 times. There's a guy in town. Last year, we trained all of the Ann Arbor City cops and had to do them over quite a period of time because most of them are on the road. And I was walking to the second of, I think, 8 or 9 sessions, and I got a call from this guy in the community. You know who it is. Yeah. And this guy called me to tell me that he had 8 years of continuous sobriety. And I kidded him that after 8 years of him being continuously in sobriety, that we were getting close to the halfway mark where I had now seen him more sober than I had seen him drunk. Because I had seen him drunk over the last 25, 30 years, thousands of times, usually passed out on the sidewalk, sometimes frozen to the sidewalk in weather like this so that the EMTs would have to get hot water and thaw him so they could pull him off the sidewalk and take him to the ER. He's been a recipient of our services easily 100 times. And that doesn't count all the emergency rooms he went to, all the cop pickups, just epic, right? And so he was telling me, he wanted me to know that he had 8 years. Miracle of biblical proportion that this guy is sober. And I asked his permission to tell these cops for the rest of the training about this guy. And so at each session from there on, I was able to say at a certain point, how many of you know John? And they would all go, their eyes would get wide. And I say, you thought he died, right? Because you hadn't seen him. You hadn't picked him up in ages, but all of you had picked him up 50 times, right? And I was able to tell them that this guy was sober. And a number of them teared up, saying these are tough guys, because they could not believe that this guy. Now, the 50th or the 52nd trip to Spera didn't make a difference, and the 53rd was a charm. Takes what it takes. Takes what it takes. And it would be fair to say that this guy had a lot of bottoms, right? I have a friend who spoke at our Ed series last year, a guy named Father Greg Boyle, who founded an organization in East LA called Homeboy Industries. And he treats, most of the people he treats are addicts and alcoholics, and he says they suffer from a lethal absence of hope, right? And that's really true. The self-talk of untreated addiction is a self-talk of despair. What addicts and alcoholics say in their heads to themselves are things like, nothing lasts, everything breaks, nobody stays, I can't do this, I can't do this, right? And it's this constant circular language of despair that people have to overcome in order to come into recovery. That's why I say it's a noble act to come into sobriety. But if a lethal absence, if despair is the enemy of recovery, what's the solution? Hope. Okay, so it begs the question, how do you find hope? Hope comes from seeing somebody on the other side. So she's going to talk for 10 minutes.
Okay.
5-10 minutes.
About hope or just?
No, just tell your
Just
story.
about like my experience?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she's a beast. I want to hear her
Hi,
story.
my name is Kelsey. I'm a person in recovery. I've been sober since the 14th of July, 2015. So I started using substances.
4.5 years, yeah?
Yeah. I started using substances when I was 12 years old. I started smoking weed, and that progressed. When I was 13, my dad had a brain tumor, and he was prescribed these different prescription medications that I would take. And eventually that progressed even further to heavier drugs. And I started using IV narcotics when I was 16. And yeah, so that kind of took over my life for 5 years. And what Jim was talking about, how your world really shrinks down. It starts off you have a lot of things. I was in gymnastics, I ran cross country, I did sports, I was good at school, and slowly but surely I stopped doing sports, I stopped going to school. I got expelled from high school 3 different times, and I got arrested multiple times for multiple different things. It didn't matter what the consequences were. I wasn't going to stop. I didn't have that power. And I remember thinking that before I kind of was introduced to AA, I remember I would Google if people ever got sober, because I just hadn't experienced it or seen anybody do it, or believed that it was possible. And eventually my mom took me to a meeting when I was 14, because I was stealing her money to smoke weed, and she was you have a problem. And I was no, I don't. So that was my first experience with AA. But later, when things had gotten a lot worse, I was able to relate to people, and I think that that was really, really important for me, because I had gone to a lot of different therapists, and I just kept trying to address this issue in different ways, but I hadn't connected with somebody else who had shared the same experience as me, that was able to tell me that things got better. I didn't think that anybody was as bad as me, or that anybody like me would possibly have any type of normal life. Yeah, I think that hope was really vital, and yeah, meeting those people and following what they told me to do, and taking those suggestions from people that had been in a similar spot, because I wasn't capable of hearing it from somebody else, because I was what do you know, congratulations, you went to school, and but you don't know what it's to be me. But the people that did, I feel were able to really get through to me. And yeah, my life has really transformed because of that. I've gone back to school. I currently go to the University of Michigan, which is a big deal to me since I didn't graduate high school. I'm able to house manage for Dawn Farm, which is an incredible opportunity to give back to people. Yeah, I don't know.
What are you studying?
I'm studying Earth and Environmental Science.
What do you want to do? What's your
I don't know exactly, but I kind of want to study more hydrology stuff and water treatment type stuff. I know that sounds weird, but yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
How many sponsees you got?
I I just have one right now.
Okay.
It's kind of hard house managing because all of the people that go through
Right.
services, like I'm not able to
Right.
sponsor them. So, yeah.
Anybody got any questions for Kelsey? I wanted to give you an opportunity. Yeah, in the back.
The day before I got sober, so before I got sober the last time, and that wasn't the first time I tried to get sober, I had gone to the farm for 3 months and I was in housing for 2 months and I got high. The last time I got high was just one time. And I think that like I had enough experience in like AA and in the community that like when I went back to like what I had been doing, like it just didn't feel like that was what I wanted anymore.
Well, the other question is, how many phone numbers of women in the recovering community do you have?
I have a lot, yeah.
Right.
It started off like when I was like getting sober, I would like get numbers from like everybody, and now like I have numbers of people that like call me. I don't know that I have, but like I have, maybe not recently, but I have like, when I was like getting sober, I was pretty young because I got sober when I was 21, which is unusual. Like I celebrated my 21st birthday in the farm. But
Did you get a cake?
They did make me a cake and they put like veggie straws on it or something weird.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that like things had just gotten so bad for me that I couldn't really like see them going on. And I don't think that you have to like be old or like I don't think you have to like keep going. I think that the beautiful thing about like AA is that like you can stop at like any point. Like you don't have to, you know, lose everything or like continue on for like 40 years, you know, I mean it happens, but like it doesn't have to be that way.
Other questions?
I think like hearing other people who had like similar experiences and like telling me that it gets better.
All right, she's going to stick around so you can grab her after. Thanks, kiddo. Thanks. And that's how people find hope, right? You have to see enough people on the other side who say, you know, I was sitting right where you are, and it's better here, right? It's better here. You get, you know, the trick is not to reduce consequences. The trick is to get to the point where you find yourself facing a situation where historically using was the best possible option, and it's no longer the best option. And that really comes from George Vaillant is still alive, is a researcher, author of some of you may have heard of the Harvard study. He spoke in our Ed series a couple of years ago. It's the longest adult study on addiction in the history of mankind. And he said, if you want to treat an illness that has no easy cure, first of all, treat them with hope, right? I have a friend who says that 12-step programs are like Amway without the money. It's like a grand pyramid scheme, except that there's no money changing hands. So, all right. I got lots of hope quotes. So, a few things you can do as a community. Support treatment. Like I say, most of the treatment that existed, most of the options around are gone. So anything you can do to support treatment and outreach and services and, you know, community-based things is a good thing. Prescription reforms, anything you follow, it's a lot in the news about pharma. And also a simple thing you could do is look in your medicine cabinet. A lot of kids we end up seeing their first exposure to a prescription opiate, for example, or a benzodiazepine was in grandma's medicine cabinet. Public policy. We occasionally find ourselves playing a role in public policy. There's a, what do they call it? It used to be if you called on an overdose and the cops came, you could be arrested. Good Samaritan law. The Michigan Good Samaritan law happened with our investment, with people affiliated with the farm talking to their representatives and stuff. And there's other stuff going on. Did you have? Well, it used to be that if you had a kid who overdosed in your house and you called the cops, they could arrest you because there would be drugs present there. And that's no longer true. And in fact, notoriously, this hospital, it happened lots of times where folks on the street who were using had one in their midst who would overdose, and they'd drive by the ER and roll them out of the car. And all of us know people who've died. They found them in a Walmart parking lot because they were afraid to take them to a hospital or some other service. So, and of course, all the movement toward Narcan rescues and everything. Now, Narcan is a great thing, trying to save addicts' lives. Now, if we can make Narcan like defibrillators, then we're going to say something, right? Because I'm sure in the hall there's a portable defib unit, and if somebody were to have the misfortune of having a heart attack in here, we could go grab it and have a decent chance of saving your life, which is a great thing. What do you think would happen after that moment? We'd call 911, right? And 911 would come, and what would they do? They would take the person to a hospital to give them treatment for their heart problem, right? We're not there with Narcan. We rescue people and save their lives, and then they say, well, okay, go home now. It's appalling. So we're not there, and public policy changes are going to fix that over time, hopefully. Fight stigma. Stigma's better. I've been in the field a long time. Stigma's better than it used to be. 50 years ago, if you were an alcoholic and a member of AA, your boss could find out and fire you. Not for being an alcoholic, but for being in AA, right? And so it's better than that now. And now there are people who are empowered. And every major school in this county has a collegiate recovery program, right? U of M, EMU, WCC all have robust student recovery programs. It's great. It's a start, but a lot needs to be done. And stay informed. And there is a lot coming to this, coming to the rest of the programs. One of the things I will say, because it's so much on the news, that if you read the New York Times regularly, you would begin to believe that opiate addicts don't get better. And in fact, the driving force behind a lot of the interventions for opiate addicts is just that. They don't get better, therefore, keeping them from overdosing and dying is a laudable goal. Keeping them from contracting HIV and Hep C, both for the human cost and the societal financial cost. Keeping them from breaking into my home and stealing my computer while I'm here talking to you guys. All those three things are reasonable goals if the postulate is correct that opiate addicts don't get better. It's not true. And so a bunch of people here in town said, this makes no sense. We read the newspaper, we watch TV. It's like we're mythical creatures. They don't think we're real, right? And so this grassroots movement of recovering opiate addicts decided to launch this thing called the Unicorn Project. The website is unicornsarereal.org. And in order to have your story told on this site, you have to be a recovering opioid addict with more than 5 years of abstinent recovery. And there are more added. I don't know how many are on it now, dozens. And there are more added all the time, right? And they did it really just so that somebody can go there and say, well, here are all these people who are regular folks who, are doing the deal, who are, going to school and raising kids and paying taxes, right? And so there's lots of opportunities to learn about this kind of stuff. We have a news blog. We have a blog on our website, on the John Farm website. And there's another, our primary author of the website recently moved to another facility in Livonia, but he's maintained his his blogging at a place called recoveryreview.blog. And there's a whole collection of guys who are writing for that. And the website is up on the next slide, I think. Yeah, recoveryreview.blog. There are lots of places to find more information. You go to our website is full of stuff. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. My experience has been those symptoms are the beginning of addiction, right? That sense of being an outsider, of being uncomfortable in your skin, of never feeling right size, of waking up every morning afraid, waking up with that sense of dread, are characteristics of untreated addiction. And invariably, they happen to people before they ever pick up a drink or a drug. You know, I mean, what's the trigger? I mean, there are all sorts of people doing research on it. I will give you an example. There's a whole arm of addiction research on elderly onset addiction, right? Where you get people who drink, let's say for alcohol, drink and without incident until they're 65. And then something happens. It might be a medical condition, it might be some change in meds, might be an environmental circumstance, and 18 months later, they're having blackouts, they have tissue tolerance. I used to describe, this dates me, how many of you know what a hand grip train track changer is? Anybody? That makes me feel good. The old guy in the back. Yeah. Well, you go to a rural train depot, you'll find something that looks a little like a pistol grip, and you can grab this thing, squeeze it, and move it, and the train tracks will go like that. Okay? Now, yeah, and so you should route it into a yard or something like that. And of course now it's all automatic, but back in the day, that's how you would move people onto a different track. Well, you think about how much pressure does it take to move that switch, right? Well, it appears that it's certainly possible that for some people, you could flip that switch at age 15 or younger, right? And for other people, it may take some kind of circumstance. They have a sticky switch, but once it sets into motion, this progression takes place. And, you know, anecdotally, certainly years ago, we used to say that the progression, that's the other thing, I didn't talk about the fact that this is a progressive that gets worse over time. And generally speaking, historically, we've seen that if you start using when you're 21, it might take 15 years for you to develop sufficient symptoms to warrant some obvious intervention. If you start at age 15, it might take 15 months, right? So it appears to be compressed. So, but I mean, there's lots of research going on. You know, we were joking before we started today that when I started in the field, we used to talk about the brain disease stuff. We used to call it, it was called the X factor, right? We used to look at addiction and like looking at a computer and saying, I think there's something electronic going on in there. Like, I mean, we knew, we just didn't know what it was. And now, like I say, come back and hear Dr. Christensen, Dr. Weiner, I don't know who else is talking. There's an enormous amount of brain science now. It's not up for grabs anymore. The idea of whether or not this is legitimately a brain disease, settled science. So, other questions? Yeah. You know, it's really funny because I was going to say there was one more thing I didn't say, and it was related to prevention. I'm not a fan of prevention. I take that back. No one's smoking a cigarette, which is amazing in here, right? And I've smoked cigarettes on airplanes. That's how old I am. But that's an example of the idea that prevention does work. That being said, I think by and large prevention activities related to drug and alcohol addiction range from stupid to worse. They just tend to be. I mean, all the stuff. I mean, we got people at the farm all the time with DARE T-shirts. That doesn't work. I mean, I've seen meta study, and I got no problem with police going into schools, but DARE, make no question, the science on it is compelling. Doesn't work. Sometimes some of these things, some of these interventions that look good actually contribute to. Now, and here's the reason. Let's say we go into a high school or a middle school and we take 100 kids in a classroom and we educate them all about diabetes, right? It's a good thing, nothing wrong with it, right? But we don't have any expectation that we're going to reduce the number of people who convert to diabetes. You know why? Because diabetes has to do with having a bad pancreas. And though there are some contributing factors, diabetes is a chronic disease, and you don't catch it by eating too much chocolate cake. You catch it by having a pancreas that's disordered, right? Addiction's the same way, you know. We don't go into the school talking about allergies to peas, because who cares, right? A certain percentage of 100 kids are going to develop. We know that a third of them are probably not going to drink alcohol, which is amazing. I think particularly because the incentive to drink in this culture is so huge. I used to talk more about it. I mean, you want an example of how endemic alcohol is in our culture? I'm going to show of hands. How many of you believe alcohol, driving under the influence of alcohol ought to be against the law? Raise your hands. And hold them high so that I could see anybody who's not raising their hands. So I wait until you leave to go drive, right? Yeah, by and large, right? We all agree. Driving under the influence of alcohol is against the law, right? Ready to be honest? You won't be on the video, okay? I promise. How many of you drank beverage alcohol and slid into the front seat of your car and drove your car under the influence of alcohol? Raise your hands. Yeah, see? Because we believe, one of the problems with substance use in our culture is that we actually believe that drunk driving is only against the law. It's only a crime if you get caught. And if you made it, and I guarantee you, most of you don't believe that you were drunk drivers, that you were scofflaws, but that it wasn't really drunk driving because you didn't get arrested. Think about that, right? So we've got some changing to do culturally about how we approach the concept of getting intoxicated. No, but those are symptoms of addiction, right? Just like other schizophrenia has positive and negative symptoms, right? You think of schizophrenia as being someone being delusional, but there are negative symptoms associated with it. Those symptoms are part of addiction. And it gets complicated because if I had a nickel for every addict or alcoholic, particularly in the last 30, 35 years, who gets diagnosed with a mood disorder, right? They get diagnosed with depression or anxiety. And catch me afterwards if you're interested. The science is absolutely compelling that most addicts and alcoholics don't have co-occurring mood disorders. If you don't diagnose them 45 minutes after their last hit on a crack pipe. I mean, it sounds easy, right? The leading authority on comorbidity in the United States, a guy named Mark Shuckett, says, wait 3 weeks of robust recovery, right? And I'll tell you real quick the study, because we've got a couple minutes. He went into treatment centers all over the country, and he was part of something that I don't know how many of you know what the DSM is, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Well, and he is the head of the comorbidity committee. Maybe he's not the head anymore, but he was the head of the comorbidity committee for the DSM for a long time. He's been in the field. He's older than me. And what he did was he went into treatment centers across the United States and created a MAST, an assessment tool based on the DSM, and assessed thousands of people walking into a drug and alcohol treatment center like Dawn Farm. And what he found was that using this assessment tool, 85+% of the people walking into this treatment center qualified for a diagnosis of a mood disorder, anxiety or depression, right? Well, now that doesn't surprise anybody. However, he then came back, his team came back all over the country 3 weeks later and reassessed all those individuals, and the symptoms qualifying for a mood disorder had dropped so that about 17% of the people were qualified for a diagnosis of a mood disorder. That is, in 3 weeks, a precipitous drop. But notable was that drop took place whether a person was on a classic antidepressant, an SSRI, a serotonin drug, a placebo, or nothing. And so his advice is wait. Wait until a person's in 3 weeks is a small clinical window. And you think about how long it takes for an antidepressant to work. 3 weeks is, you know. And so he says wait. He says now, if a person is suicidally depressed, you're not going to wait. You're going to intervene. And if you need to intervene in a pharmacological way, you're going to do it. If someone's psychotic and they're delusional, you're not going to wait. But failing that, if a person is merely dysthymic, if they're having mood swings, if they're depressed, wait, right? Nobody waits. We wait. We're pretty good at waiting because we've actually read this research and it's really persuasive stuff. I do many of the interviews to have people come into the farm, and people get diagnosed when they still have a blood alcohol level, and they're put on various meds, sometimes really astonishing combinations of medications. So. But back to prevention, I will tell you, I speak at a lot of church groups, and I always tell them the same thing, because they'll say, well, what can we do as a congregation to impact this? And I always tell them the same thing, and they never ask me back, right? My 2 suggestions are, work to ban alcohol advertising on television, right? Because you really want to do something, change the culture. I was a consultant 30 years ago for the city of Ann Arbor, and at the time they had a fire in their belly and they said, well, what can we do? And we said, make a public statement saying that we don't tolerate the use of illegal drugs and we don't tolerate the illegal use of legal drugs in our community. And they never called us again. Right? And then the other thing I offer to church groups, and maybe any group could consider it, but in the context of a church group, I say, fast for a year from mood-altering substances for the sake of your children. Decide as a group that you won't drink beverage alcohol for a year as a fast for your kids, and see where it takes you, right? Number one, you become much more sympathetic to some of the people in this room and many of the people who come out of our treatment center who have to live in the middle of a culture that loves alcohol, that loves getting intoxicated. And I will share, I used to share it more commonly, but you want to know how you talk about prevention. Schools are full of prevention. I used to do prevention lectures in the 70s. And we've got DARE, and we've got various staged car crashes at high school parking lots and stuff, and all sorts of crap. What's the prevention model for adults in the United States? Don't you know? Well, that's terrible that you don't know, but you do know. Designated driver. Now, I'm all in favor of people not driving drunk and making it easier for people who are drinking not to drive drunk. However, if you deconstruct that particular legal thing in our society, what is it really saying? Well, it's saying that we prize intoxication in our society so much that we're willing to create a national strategy that allows us to drink with a certain degree of impunity, right? So we're going to make you, it's Friday night, and you know, it's been a hard week, and we really want to party. So we're picking her. You're going to be the sucker who drives us all home, right? And the reason we're going to do that is because we really like to get intoxicated. We really do. You don't have to be an alcoholic. We as a society really like this stuff. And until we start to address some of that stuff, that's broad brush, how we think about substances, we're always going to have, always going to have a problem. So, does that help? Okay. Any other questions? We got 2 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, if there was any science that said that happened, I'd share it with you. No, I mean, is it important for parents to have open communication with their kids? Sure. Will it prevent their kid from developing an addiction? Yeah, well, but unfortunately, yeah, one of the problems is that if you really want to do something that would help kids, or if treatment was available on demand, I mean, it is ironic. You know, Dawn Farm was started in '73, and there were 4 of us. We rented this farmhouse. the other 3 people went on the staff. I was working at CMH, so I went on the board. And we didn't know what the hell we were doing. It was a commune, right? You couldn't do that today, right? But the fact that we've survived all these years is completely ludicrous. We were like the country, we were the redheaded stepchild. There's no good reason why we should still be around. Arguably, one of the biggest reasons is we never chased money, which saved us in a weird way. But if you got a kid who needs treatment, the closest residential program for adolescent substance abuse is in Saginaw. Now, we have an outpatient adolescent, but if you want a kid, back in the day, they were everywhere. There was a 20-bed adolescent program about a walking distance from here, right? It's been long gone. It's been gone for 25 years, right? Yeah. That's what, I mean, really, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about a landscape where you want help, you're in trouble. Yeah. Thank God for the recovering community. Back when the farm started, no licensing, no funding. We didn't know what we were doing. But a few years later, in the late 70s, the hospitals all figured out that there were no DRGs for addiction treatment. Right? Now, DRG is a designated or diagnostic reimbursement group. And I'll tell you my example. I had this knee replaced a few years ago. And every week I would get the statement from the insurance company where it said, here's how much they billed for your PT. And here's your little measly $10 copay. And here's how much Priority Health paid. And here's how much they ate as the cost of doing business. That's because of a DRG for physical therapy for titanium knee. And everything in medicine has a DRG. But back in '77, the first one was at Chelsea Hospital. No DRGs, right? So they figured out, we hire a part-time medical director and a couple of social workers and show some films. And we bill full hospital bed day rates. Remember, I said it was an economic model, right? And everybody made money. Blew it out. Catherine McCauley, don't quote me, but Catherine McCauley built here on Oaks and made somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million profit the first year they were up and running. It's okay. I don't have a problem with it, except that it was a cash cow, but everybody, they had layers of administration. All of them did, all across the country. They were rolling in it, right? The first gatekeeper from the insurance company called and said, you have Mr. Jones, and we agreed to fund this Mr. Jones for 28 days. Unfortunately, we can't do that anymore, so we'll fund him for 25 days. And the world hung in the balance. And I believe they could have said, 28 days is our product. Hate to call it a product, but they could have said 28 days is what we really believe in. This is how we produce winners, right? They could have done that. None of them did that. The other thing they could have done is they could have said, okay, pay us for 25 days. We're going to treat them for 28 days because that's what we believe in. And we just won't get paid for 3 days, but we're not losing any money, because the secret about hospital-based addiction treatment and residential, just like us, it's all fixed costs. The difference between full and empty, food, right? My workman's comp at the farm is the same whether I have 49 beds full or 10 beds full, right? So they weren't losing money, they just weren't making any more money. And to a man, across the United States, they all started treating people for 25 days. And of course, once you give up ownership of your product, you no longer own your product. And so somebody came along and suddenly it was 22 days and 18 days. And of course, typically, like I say, the 2 hospitals in the region, Southeast Michigan, are, if you can get 12 to 14 days, you got pretty good insurance, because they're dictating terms, right? And the entire field was top heavy with all this money that they'd made. They had layers and layers of administration, and they all went out of business. Burned them to the ground. Not that they didn't deserve it. They went to the trough, and then managed care caught them. So, all right. Thank you. Thanks for coming.